Welcome to Fridays with Vistage. My name is Bill Black, and I'm a Vistage member and the founder of ExitCoachRadio.com, the information station for busy business owners, and I'll be your moderator today. Today, Chelsea Wood and Christine Gunn of Insperity will discuss the critical importance of human capital, and you will find out where productive and profitable businesses operate effectively. This webinar will focus particularly on how a human capital strategy can make a measurable difference in your company's profitability. Learn why a human capital strategic plan is just as important as a strategic plan for your business, and how you can better prepare your business for sustained growth by investing in your human capital. Today's webcast is presented by Insperity. Insperity has been an HR industry leader for nearly 30 years, and they offer a full suite of effective human resources and business performance solutions, including cutting-edge HR technologies, human resource management services, HR education, training, and consulting. To put it simply, Insperity is a single provider offering everything a company needs, from HR software to services. For over 25 years, Christine Gunn has worked with executive leaders and intact teams to improve leadership effectiveness, align people and processes, identify emerging issues, and assess the sustainability of organizational initiatives and interventions. She works directly with executive teams, senior staff, and line managers facing diverse strategic business challenges such as fast growth, market shifts, mergers and acquisitions, cultural alignment, and developing the next generation of leaders. Her passion is to challenge the status quo by initiating conversations that move teams into action. Christine joined Insperity in February 2009, and she holds certifications in Human Capital Strategies, Franklin Covey for facilitation, the Center for Creative Leadership, Situational Leadership, DISC, In-Color Insight, Culture Link, and DDI. And she's based in Orange County, California. Chelsea Wood, for over a decade, has partnered with leadership teams to identify and address their unique business challenges related to operational performance, strategy, business development, and human capital. Prior to joining the team, she managed new growth initiatives such as mergers, acquisitions, and other strategic partnerships for a multi-state integrated health system. Chelsea is a certified merger and acquisition advisor through the Alliance of Merger and Acquisition Advisors and a Six Sigma Green Belt. Chelsea has a bachelor's degree in psychology from Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, and a master's degree in industrial organizational psychology from the Chicago School. Chelsea is based in St. Louis, Missouri. Chelsea, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Well, thank you, Bill, for that introduction. Hello and welcome, everyone. Christine and I are so excited to join you today to talk about our human capital work with organizations all across the country. We really focus on keeping them vital and growing. I think we all can agree that today the stakes are higher than ever to create competitive advantage. That's why we're going to focus on how to aligning your leadership, culture, and human capital practices will keep you ahead of the curve. During this webinar, Christine and I will be talking about how growth-focused companies view capital. We'll talk about some best practices to help you keep focused on minimizing risks, while at the same time improving employee productivity through better engagement. We'll talk about why a human capital strategy can make a measurable difference in your profitability. We'll talk about why alignment is a critical differentiator that you should consider. And lastly, we'll talk about the most pressing critical human capital issues facing growth-focused companies today. So let's dive in. I'm going to start with the question, what is capital? I think everyone has some idea of the word when they hear it. For this purpose, though, we'll use the dictionary.com definition of the wealth, whether in money or property, owned or employed in business by an individual, firm, corporation. While capital refers to something of value, most executives and financial analysts look to the company income statement to understand the organization's capital. And while this reveals a story of financial strengths and vulnerabilities of the organization, does it really reflect the whole story? Because we personally think that there's much more than that. What about the human aspect of capital? Because we think that when you get to the heart of the matter, as you look at the key functions in a business, sales and marketing, operations, finance, it's the people who produce your product and services. It's your people who turn prospects into returning customers and hopefully into raving fans. It's your people that show up every day to make your vision a reality. But we also recognize that investing in people can be tough. In fact, many of the executives that I work with, it's a constant struggle with investing in human capital because it's seen as fluffy, Or I had a leader tell me the other day that he's just too busy to bother with yet another distraction from operations. But while human capital isn't a line item that you're going to find on the income statement, the big idea here is that it's not the business itself feeding the income statement. It's not those line items. It's rather the people that are providing the exceptional customer service and new ideas that they're generating that is giving you the values you see on an income statement. Can we provide the value of human capital, Christine?
Can we prove it? Yes, we can, as a matter of fact. Well, as Bill had mentioned in the introduction, Insperity is an organization that is passionate about human capital practices and HR practices in business. And so it really bothered us that a lot of our clients were kind of missing the mark when it came to investing in their human capital. So we did a study. We conducted a study where we decided to review the best places to work organizations, the top 100, actually Fortune's list, the top 100 best places to work. And what we did was we compared those companies with the performance of similar size companies that are represented in the Dow, the NASDAQ, and the S&P 500. And we did. We wanted to know, do the best places to work actually have different results than everyone else? And here's what we found, interesting statistics. The green bar, as you can see here, represents those on the Fortune 100 list. And look at their performance year over year, 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008. They outperformed the others. And then look at 2009. And I'm sure we all remember 2009, not a great year, not a great time in our country's history, really. But here we see that even then, the companies on the Fortune's list lost less value than the NASDAQ and S&P and the Dow combined. Pretty incredible. And then taking it a step further, what I think is also incredible is that in 2010, these companies rebounded much faster than their counterparts. Pretty incredible what happened in 2010. So this does reinforce our theory that, yeah, people practices actually do pay off, and they pay off in any kind of economy. But this is just one study, and this is a study that we conducted. We took this another step further, and we did some research, and we found another great study by Harvard Business School. And what they did was they conducted a study of 435 publicly traded companies, and they ranked them on the sophistication of their HR practices. And they compared the top 10% versus what the bottom 10% are doing. And again, we find some really interesting statistics that speak to this notion of really investing in human capital. So if you look at this graph, left to right, the first one talks about hiring based on a validated selection test. And what we see here is that the top 10% of those companies actually had a test, some type of a validation test in place 30%, roughly 30% of the time. And those in the bottom 10%, 4% of the time they used a selected validation test. So again, when you look at retention strategies or recruiting strategies, the best companies use some type of a validated test. The next one speaks to formal HR. Do you have a formal HR plan in place? And we can see that the top companies, top 10%, yeah, they do, 46% of the time versus only roughly 5% of the time for the lowest performing companies. And then number 3 is probably one of my favorites. This speaks to the notion of training employees. The top companies spend 72 hours per employee on training and development. Isn't that incredible? And then the bottom 10% only invest 13 and change in terms of their training and development. And then look at the next one. This is incredible. How many qualified applicants per position? Well, the top 10% of companies had 36 qualified candidates for every job. Can you imagine? Versus only 8 for those organizations that did not. So imagine if you are the hiring manager. Would you rather have 36 applicants for the particular role you're looking to fill, or would you rather have 8? Your chances of hiring an A player are much higher if you've got a lot more candidates. So how do these companies perform? Well, on the right side, we can see that companies with solid HR practices tend to have higher performing employees. They also tend to have employees that are more engaged. And this graph really, in this one, we see that the top 10% generated 5 times the sale per employee compared to that bottom 10%. Pretty incredible. And companies that value their people saw market value soar to more than 11 times the book value. So between our survey here at Insperity and the Harvard Business School study, we can see, yes, we can answer the question with confidence that, yeah, it pays dividends to invest in your human capital. Now, the question that you might be asking yourself right now, though, is, okay, this is great, but where do I get started? And Chelsea is going to share some big ideas around where do we start.
Thanks, Christine. Those really are some incredible statistics, and they support everything that we see in our clients and what we talk to them about. And you'll hear us reference that research all throughout this presentation. With so many competing priorities, where do you begin? And for me, I always think back to a quote that I heard from Richard Branson, and he said something like, I think the model for starting employee engagement activities has to be embedded in everything you do. He's right. Building a human capital infrastructure starts with embedding these practices in everything you do, from the employee's first contact with the recruiter to their departure from your organization. At Insperity, we frame our work around what we fondly refer to as ARM Doctor, which is a model you see on the slide. So it's attract, it's retain, maintain, develop, and reward. Those are the 5 components of an HR or of a human capital plan. So when you think about attract, you want to ask yourself this question: why would someone want to work for your company? What is it about what you do that will make them feel like they're making a difference? Attracting talent refers to those things that have to be in place before you actually hire someone. It's the branding, it's the benefits, it's the compensation, it's the way you communicate about work-life balance. It's the culture. The next thing is retain. So ask yourself, why would someone stay with your company? What is it that keeps the good people there? When you look to maintain, it's how do you as a company stay compliant with all of the rules and regulations and requirements that are required of you as an employer? And then develop, how do you maximize the value of each human that works in your organization? And then when you think about rewarding, how do you show your appreciation to those people that show up day in and day out to make your vision a reality? If we could pause here for a second and take a poll, we want to find out, how do you feel about your own human capital practices? Do you feel like you have consistent ones in place? Go ahead and answer, yes, we do. We have a few, but they're not consistent, or no, we don't have any at all.
I think while folks are voting, Chelsea, I just want to underline, for those people that may be on the call today, the whole ARM Doctor approach is what we use when we sit down with a team of executives or senior leadership, and it's really quite simple. It sounds very simple, but it's asking those compelling questions. It becomes a very a simple template to say exactly the questions you were mentioning, right? How are we attracting? And if we're not doing something different, our competition is, what is it that's going to attract people here, retain them? It's an eye-opening conversation for organizations, and it's a great template to start. I just want to underline that because it's very practical.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree. The poll should be closing now, I assume? Are the results on the screen, Christine?
Not yet. Not yet. All right, folks. Here we go. Chelsea, it looks like we have the middle. We've got 58% of the folks saying that we do have a few human capital practices in place. we've got 12% that say no and 30% that say, yeah, they do. So it seems like kind of the middle group. We have some in place, but we're not consistent. Yeah, so that's kind of echoes.
Very, very similar. Exactly. Very similar to what we experience with our clients. Because often in a growing firm, the level of infrastructure that's required to support the growth that you experience, it's viewed as a distraction because you've got so many things to do to keep growing. But it really, this infrastructure, these standard policies and procedures are a mechanism that will help you achieve greater results. Just like the Harvard Business Study said, the businesses that have formal HR plans and standard policies and practices in place, they do see stronger returns to the bottom line.
I think the key word here is consistency. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just noting, looking at the statistics. Yeah, I think the big deal here is consistency. And that is tough, to your point, is there's so much complexity going on in organizations that to really be consistent is difficult. And that's, hopefully this session today will really pinpoint some areas that you can raise that consistency. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you, Chelsea. Go ahead.
No, please. And we do. We will address actually the consistency later as one of our issues because we do see that, both the inconsistent application but also the knowledge of. And so just like you would expect a doctor to diagnose a problem before prescribing medication, at Insperity, we believe that a world-class people strategy has to begin with investigating the root problem using diagnostic tools. And so that's what we do. For nearly a decade, we've been surveying leaders in growing companies across the country, talking about leadership alignment, management proficiency, exactly what Christine and I were just talking about, and then potential employment risk exposures, because by not doing things in a standard way, you are exposing yourself to risk. The results have been eye-opening both for us as well as our clients who honestly just weren't aware. They were just going and growing with their business. So let's talk about how our tool works, because we believe that alignment starts at the top and kind of works its way throughout the organization. We start by asking the leadership team about their individual perceptions of how they attract people, how they engage and keep people dedicated to their mission, how they manage the day-to-day blocking and tackling of their own policies and procedures, and then how they develop their workforce and reward their successes. Then we take those results and we put them into a easily digestible format so everyone's answers are compiled in one place. We use green boxes to show those that said yes. We use yellow for those that were uncertain, and we use red for those that said no. We even use a blue box just to let people know if someone didn't answer the question. Throughout our presentation today, we're going to share the output of this tool, just like a leader that we're working with would see. And we're going to do this to discuss the top challenges that most growing companies face, but we'll be using actual company results so that you can get a flavor for it. Let's talk about the top human capital challenges that we've identified through our research. The first, honestly, one of the most common ones is that they have a culture by default, as opposed to one that's been purposefully created. And we'll talk more about what that means later. The second is that people don't have a clear understanding of what is expected from them. The third is that there are minimal programs in place to invest in their workforce. The fourth is that there's an inconsistency with how policies and processes are administered and enforced. The fifth one would be around not having the right people in the right roles. And then this last one is that they're using ineffective methods to manage performance. And that one's a critical one and pretty controversial, but we'll tackle it anyway. So let's take a look at our tool in action by talking about creating a culture by design, not by default. One of the questions that we ask leaders is, does the company have a culture that it works to maintain? It's a very simple question. But before we discuss the results that you can see on the next slide, let's level set real quick on how we define culture. So when we talk about culture, we mean it's how the work gets done at your organization. And it's that broad for a reason. It's literally everything that causes your company to function. Every organization has a culture. The question is, do you have a culture that's the result of a focused effort, or is it the way that it is? So let's talk about how that client answered the question. Okay, so as you can see, it's a variety of red, yellow, green, and blue. So the CEO of the company believes the company has a culture of design, one that they work to maintain. But as you move through his executive team, that's not the case. The controller, The director of IT, they're uncertain about the culture, where the VP of Ops and the director of home delivery, they said no, simply no. They don't have one that they're trying to maintain. And as you go deeper into the organization through the ops group, you can see that it's clearly not a top priority for them, because you got one person saying yes, you've got two people saying no, you've got other people that are uncertain. So our finding is that where most organizations get into trouble is the misconception that everyone is aligned. But as you can see from the results of the sample organization, that's just not really the case. And we find that pretty often, because they have to have very purposeful conversations to get aligned. And these results start those conversations. So they're reviewed with leadership team together in a room. It's very important to realize that this tool is used for organizations that are focused on improving. And so candor is critical. This is really where the hard conversations happen. Let's take a moment, just a moment, to imagine the impact to an organization of a team that is aligned in this manner. Whether or not do they have an intentional culture? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. It's an easy way to answer that question is to think about organizations where the cultures are clearly defined and well-known, and they're actively managed. These companies have been built from the ground up. Go ahead.
I think I was just going to pause for a second, and I would challenge the folks that are listening on the phone to consider how would they answer this question, and what would the folks on their senior team and down the line have to say. It's pretty interesting, I think, Chelsea, just to highlight the idea that we think that everyone is aligned, but when we do these types of surveys, what we find out is something very different. So again, just a little challenge for those, seeding a little challenge for those on the phone listening. Sorry.
No, I agree. It's a good, any of the questions that we ask, I would challenge you to kind of answer how you think your organization would respond. And so let's talk about the companies that are on the slides. And what automatically comes to mind when you see those names, those well-known names, is that they've been built from the ground up using a mixture of traits, behaviors, values, practices that reflect their beliefs. And as a customer of any of these things, you know what their culture is because it's evident in everything that they do. Whereas a culture by default may reflect a culture that you inherited or one that just develops over time without any real effort to shape it. We advise our clients when designing a culture or trying to decide what the appropriate culture for you is, start by understanding what your customers expect from you. Do they expect low prices like Walmart? Do they expect highly personalized service like the Mayo Clinic? Make sure to design your culture based on the expectations of your customer. And then embed that culture in everything you do, from recruiting and sourcing candidates to retaining and rewarding employees. We talk about leadership alignment, but we also want cultural alignment. You want everything to be in the same direction, sending the same message throughout your organization. So how do you design a culture to meet the promises you make to your customers? I'm sure is a question that just popped into your head, because it sounds easy. Culture's culture, right? You can look to who's doing well and just copy them, right? That's a common practice. We hear it all the time. If Google has swings in the conference rooms, then we want swings too. We want ping pong tables. But that's not how we view it at Insperity, and it's not how our friends at the Corporate Development Group in Denver view. We all believe that there are 4 primary cultures. The differentiator is that the best companies are relentless about attracting top talent that will thrive within their culture, delivering on what they are promising their customers. Because what fits one isn't necessarily going to fit another. So if you are the same type of business as Google, then maybe you could use some of their ideas. But if you don't, if you're not trying to provide the state-of-the-art services and the top line everything, then you probably don't want to mirror their culture, because that's not the culture that's appropriate to your organization. So let's talk about what those cultures are. So we believe that there are 4 core cultures: collaboration, control, competence, and cultivation. So let's talk about collaboration first, because it's pretty common in family-owned businesses or the family that started the firm, whether it be just a close group of friends. It's prevalent in service organizations. Companies like Disney, Southwest Airlines were founded on being collaborative. And this culture, relationships, and consensus are the key. This is a service, this is an organization that's dependent on the relationship with the customer. Think of a realtor. Without the person buying the property, the realtors can't do their job. The next one is culture. Now, control culture is probably the easiest one for people to grasp. It's about authority. It's about power. they focus on heading off any vulnerability. Order and predictability are the norms of this culture. So think nuclear power plant. Think any branch of the military. They're excellent examples of control cultures. They quickly suppress any disruption, and honestly, let's face it, we don't want to see disruption when it comes to nuclear reactors or even our military. And so the control culture is very appropriate for them and what they're promising us. The third would be competence culture. Competence culture is a culture of distinction. It's one of excellence. It's the state of the art is a lot of the language that you hear around competence cultures. It's a culture where distinctive products or services are created, and expertise and competition, they're used as benchmarks. They're just commonplace. Think of the Googles, think of the Apples of the world. They're known for recruiting and compensating to attract top-notch talent so that they can continue their promise of delivering state-of-the-art services. The last culture is cultivation. So cultivation is another easy-to-spot one, in my opinion. These are organizations that are focused on fostering or furthering the human spirit. So most nonprofits, most religious organizations would all fit under the cultivation culture. It's built on a system of beliefs, and what they're going to accomplish is based off of that, what they deem in that to be valuable. So think about Tom's Shoes as one example, or the Girl Scouts as another example. Those are cultivation cultures. You can see it when you read their organizational missions. They're here to make the world a better place. Once you identify the culture that's in service to your customers, we want you to embed it in every organization decision, from finding and recruiting candidates to retaining and rewarding employees, because every decision, HR-related or operational-related, does carry cultural implications. So let's talk about another critical human capital issue that can impede an organization's success. It's the lack of clarity around job expectations.
Yeah, and I'm going to take that one on, but I'm just left here, Chelsea, the criticality. Before I move on, I wanted to just kind of put a pin for a second and just reflect on the dynamics of culture. And I'm sure a lot of folks on the phone have heard the notion of culture eats strategy for lunch. I think it was Peter Drucker who said that. Maybe it was breakfast or lunch. The idea is, and we see this all the time, where our client organizations have terrific strategies for the organization, but unfortunately they do not have the culture that is aligned with that. And so they actually, it's like they're not in harmony, and they start working against themselves. So they're not able to have the progress or the momentum because the culture just is not aligned. And so this is probably one of the most important pieces of work that we do with executive teams and leadership, is to sit in the room and to say, where are we aligned in terms of our culture and our customer promise, and where is there fragmentation? And the idea here is that everything you do must be in support of your customer promise. At the end of the day, it is all about the customer promise and creating a culture and leadership that aligns with that. So I just wanted to pause a second and reinforce that, because, and you'll hear us talking a little bit more about culture as we go through the rest of these kind of key human capital practices, but that's probably the biggest one. All right. So moving on, the next one is really making sure that your organization has very clear job expectations. And I know that this one sounds simple, but I think it's something that a lot of organizations take for granted. And if you look at our sample company, our friends here, the senior executive team, you can see, again, a lot of variety in the answers. President and his direct reports pretty much feel, with the exception of a couple here, that employees do know their job responsibilities. But I think what's interesting is, as you go down throughout the organization, we start to see some fragmentation in people actually don't know what the job expectations are. And the IT group just says no. You know, what happens in an organization when the IT team is not clear on their responsibilities? So what do you do about it? Well, we've articulated here just a few things that you should be careful of, or make sure that you're doing in terms of creating job clarity. And again, don't take this for granted. The first one is probably my favorite, and that is clarity of purpose. A lot of times when we sit down with organizations at the beginning of the relationship, we'll ask the question, what is the purpose of the organization? And a lot of times, they'll say, well, our purpose is to make money here in our organization. And yes, making money is important. But what we're really saying is, what is it that connects employees? What is the esprit de corps of our organization that gets people excited about coming here? It's really important that employees feel a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose. I'm going to add, particularly if you have millennials in your organization, there is an expectation that there is some sense of purpose in the organization. And so that creates clarity. It creates a solid foundation for folks. And then the next one is clarity of goals. And, when people feel clear about their goals, they have a tendency to feel more confident. They feel like they can own their destiny, so to speak. And the idea is to really, as you create goals, make sure that you as an executive team are considering the big picture strategy. What is it that, where is our business headed over the next 18 months? For some organizations that are moving quickly, that might even be a 6-month purview. Where are we headed? And then what are the critical goals, are the critical priorities that are going to get us there? And then make sure that each team, each function in your organization understands the line of sight. What are they supposed to do to achieve the critical priorities in the organization? And one of my favorite ways to put this is, if we don't do this, nothing else matters. So crystal clear clarity around the vital few priorities that are going to move the needle on your business. And then number 3, again, probably another favorite of mine, is this notion of clarity of responsibility. And obviously, when everybody understands the clear lines of responsibility and authority, it creates ownership. People feel a sense of autonomy and certainty around what's their part, what is it that they own. And we like to use the RACI model, and some of you have probably heard of the RACI model. It's designed to be used as a decision type of a matrix where you might have a lot of people integrating cross-functionally among teams. It can get pretty cloudy pretty fast. Who's doing what, particularly in a matrix type of an organization? There might be duplications. People might not be communicating. The ball gets dropped. And so the RACI model helps to create clarity around who owns what. The R stands for who's responsible. This is the person who's actually doing the work, and maybe there's more than one person, but it's clarity around who's got the responsibility, who's the worker in this situation, who's accountable. At the end of the day, whose head is going to get chopped off if things don't go well, who's got that authority and that signing power on the project. And then the C stands for consulted, and consulted means who is it that needs to be consulted before a project is complete, and then at the end of the day, who just needs to be informed after the project is complete. And I have to laugh. I worked with a client just a couple weeks ago, and he said, and we're trying to embed the RACI methodology and mindset in the organization. There's a lot of moving pieces, and they're growing so quickly. But he said he walked into a meeting. There was about 30 people in a meeting, and he said, okay, if you are a C or an I, you must leave the meeting, right? So it's a discipline and it's a mindset. We don't need the C's and the I's in the room. So again, it's a great way to create clarity. If you are an organization that's moving quickly, the RACI model is a great way to help people create distinction in where they start, where they stop, and who needs to be involved in a project. So Chelsea, you are going to tackle the next human capital challenge, and that is all about investing in your people.
Absolutely. Thanks, Christine. And that was a great example. I have used RACI quite a few times in my career, and I've never seen it not be helpful. So let's talk a little bit about investing in your people. We've touched on culture and clarity. Now we want to talk about how you can get to know your people. You have to learn what your employees think, and to do that, you need to start talking to the frontline leaders and figuring out what they need to be successful. Because the key to investing in your people is building the capabilities of your frontline management. So we're going to go back to the client company as we've spent a few slides with them now to figure out how they view that they're equipping their managers. To me, this is probably the most telling story that I've seen so far. Makes you kind of curious about what the sales and marketing leader has in place to ready his team, because he's the only one saying yes. Wasn't an uncertain, it was a yes, especially given that everyone else said no to any type of company management or supervisory training. So to me, that's a very telling picture. What's interesting is that many organizations hold back on training budgets because they have a fear that once they put all of this time and money into their leaders, they're going to leave. And then that money's just walking out the door. But actually, just as many people, maybe even more, mostly top performers, leave because they don't feel valued by their employer. Companies that invest in developing their people create positive advocates for their company. And even if they do leave down the road, because that's just part of natural attrition, hopefully they'll leave being a customer for life, or someone that will always speak highly of your organization. So let's look at some things that you should consider when thinking about investing in your people. Thomas Stewart, who is the former editor of the Harvard Business Review, said that people are our most important asset. And their knowledge and experience, that intellectual capital, is the new wealth of the organization. And it really only makes good business sense to develop that asset. And if you remember from Christine's earlier slides, that companies in the top 10% of that HBR study provided 72 hours of training annually to tenured employees, while the bottom 10% only provided 14 hours of annual training. So how do you design a training platform that yields high returns? We would recommend start by reviewing your organization's growth and execution strategy. Think about what the business implications are on your talent strategy and planning. What are the roles that are critical to move your organization towards your goals? And then once you do that step, you can identify the current strengths of your current talent pool and any skills and competencies that are necessary to achieve that strategy, so that when you do talent reviews or skill assessments, you'll be able to identify gaps and start to figure out what the training and development needs are to build your leaders to deliver on your future goals. And then finally, you want to make sure that you have growth opportunities through both formal and informal programs, such as coaching or mentoring, high-potential programs, succession planning, actually sitting down and having a real succession planning session, feedback, and any kind of structured training programs. Oftentimes, it's difficult for growing organizations to pause to address these questions because they haven't had the need to implement any kind of standard operating procedures or development practices or any kind of standardized policies. Yet, as the company grows, as we've discussed, so does the need for infrastructure. Christine, could you speak to the challenge of not having standardized practices and policies?
Yes, absolutely. So this is another critical challenge that we see with our clients, is there is not any type of a consistent process in place. And this, when this starts to happen, it can really stretch the organization if there's not processes in place. And so let's take a look at our sample company. This is an actual client company, and this is not looking very good for this particular company. You can see that the president chose not to answer this. And this is just one process. This is a standard hiring process, but you can see that the frontline leaders or the direct reports to the president, they don't have any type of consistency in place. And I'll tell you where this gets important is when you want to create continuity. So one of the benefits of installing really good processes is, number one, you take the guesswork out of things and you minimize confusion, right? What we don't want to have happen is we don't want employees doing their own thing, right? If we don't establish the process, chances are they're going to try to figure it out on their own. It's kind of like if you can imagine going into Starbucks to order your favorite, caramel macchiato or whatever. and the barista decided to leave the sugar out that day because they don't think sugar is good for you, that would not be a good thing. So, or the French fries at McDonald's. Yeah.
Christine, I have a really good example of this that I won't spend a lot of time on it, but I have a client I was just working with last week that is growing exponentially. I mean, in the hundreds % of growth in the last 2 or 3 years. He's overpricing so that he stops his own growth, and he's still growing. And as a result, they're hiring from within, promoting managers, which is great. But those managers don't have the knowledge to really follow any kind of standard policies. And so they're doing things, exactly what you said. They're doing things in their own way, which is now causing legal issues. And so they've had 2 to 3 EO1 complaints against them. They've got a lawsuit against them, unemployment claims against them. And because this industry that they're in is highly regulated, as some of, I'm sure the people on the phones are, now their accreditations and licensures are at risk because they couldn't stop doing their day-to-day activities to develop their leaders and make sure that they knew how to do things properly.
Mm-hmm. I love it. I love those real-life stories, right? So that's an exact example of what can happen if there's no consistent processes in place. And I think, too, on the other side, those organizations that do have great practices in place, they create stability, right? They create that certainty and that consistency that employees have a tendency to crave in a lot of cases. So what do you do about it? Here's some ideas for you. One of the first things that you want to do when you're looking at your processes is, first of all, I'd probably choose one that has a lot of impact. And you might notice breakdowns in the system. You might notice that things are getting bottlenecked. That's a great time to sit down and ask yourself kind of go through this process. The first one is make sure to involve everybody that uses the process. Get everybody in a room to share their experiences. And then I love this notion of use and iterate. That means design a process and then get out there and test it out. Experiment, see if it works, and then come back, have the project team come back together and iterate, refine, try it again. And so don't be afraid to get out and experiment with the particular process, kind of use a beta test or a pilot example. And then the last one is make sure to measure effectiveness. Again, it sounds very easy to do, but so often organizations get stuck doing processes that don't really add any value to the organization. And so make sure that you're measuring the impact. Is it saving time? Is it helping employees feel more empowered? Make sure that you're seeing some value in the process improvement. The next one is making sure that you're hiring right, and this is a good one. Chelsea, will you take us there?
Sure. So this is a pretty common issue that our clients have, and we see it a lot actually through the tool that we're talking to you about. 90% of the time, leadership groups agree that they don't have the right people in place, and that's a pretty sobering statistic when you think about it. If you think about the issue that Christine just reviewed, the lack of standard practices and policies, if you think about the lack of management training paired with a lack of culture by design, is it really any wonder that people don't necessarily think they're hiring the right people? All of those things need to be in alignment to get the right people on the bus. So let's look at how our client organization answered this question. So as you see, only 3 people said yes. The rest of them were either uncertain or said no. I don't know what you think, but I have concerns about their ability to maintain growth if they don't think they have the right people in place. And I'll steal from Jim Collins, actually. So he said that people aren't your greatest asset. It's the right people. So let's talk about how you find the right people. The first thing that we would recommend is improving manager awareness and develop their recruiting and selection skills. Get everyone in the organization who needs to be involved on the same page. Give them the skills and the tools that they need to appropriately select candidates that are the right fit for your organization. Evaluate whether each person has exceptional ability. Are they the best in their field? You can understand their skill sets as well as personality type if you use validated pre-employment testing. If you remember back to the slide that Christine shared about the HBR article, the organizations that were really excelling used validated selection tests beyond just the general interview. Our only preface by that is just make sure that they're validated for employment and that they're a piece of the puzzle when you're selecting candidates. The last bit that we stress pretty hard really is you want to make sure that you're recruiting for a cultural fit. You need to make sure that this person's capable of delivering on your customer promise. Do they seem complementary to the culture that's necessary for your organization? If you can find a candidate that lacks a particular skill or just a little bit of a gap, but they're a really great fit for your organization, we would urge you to consider training them to develop those skills, because we always say you should hire for fit and train for function, because it's much easier to teach someone, a new skill, but it's a lot harder to teach them how to be somebody other than themselves. So when you're looking for the right people, there's no one-size-fits-all. It's what's appropriate for your organization. But there are a few overall leadership competencies that we find most often in high-performing organizations. And those are things like focus, somebody that is focused on the critical priorities of the business, somebody that's motivated to move their organizational forward, or they're energized, somebody that can make smart decisions and can do so even in the face of a crisis, and that's being decisive. Agile leaders that can quickly adapt, especially with today's economy and ever-changing business requirements. As we know, it's ever-changing. Collaborative leaders that, even if necessary, their personal goals will take a backseat to the organization's priorities. Resilient leaders, because we all go through challenging times as organizations, but leaders in this space can face challenges head-on and then get right back up and keep going. Coachable leaders. So even if you've got a leader that has a great deal of experience, we want the ones that never stop learning or are constantly open for coaching. And lastly, follow through. We want leaders that will do what they say on time, every time. So assuming that you've identified the necessary culture, you've explained job expectations to your employees, you've invested in your managers, you've designed standard processes and practices, and now you understand how to recruit the right people, the last piece Christine's going to discuss is that controversial concept that we talked about earlier of managing the performance of the team.
Right. Interesting. Thank you, Chelsea. This is an area that is getting a lot of press these days, and I think, quite honestly, it's for good reason. I think at least our client organizations are starting to realize that, particularly with the younger talent in the workforce, is that we have to stay relevant. We have to constantly be looking at the effectiveness of our practices. And so organizations are starting to ask, do our performance processes, are they valid? Are they doing anything? I think one of the biggest frustrations a lot of leaders have, and employees as well, is they go through this kind of laborious once-a-year performance review process, and then once the performance review is done, they tuck it away in the drawer. Nobody ever looks at it. It's not something that is living and breathing in the organization. And so people are looking at doing things a little bit different when it comes to performance management. Let's look at our client companies. This, again, we see lots of variety going on here in the organization, not trending in a particularly good direction here. So this is an organization that does not take time for any type of performance reviews for employees, and hopefully they're having some performance conversations, but it's important to have both. It's important to have some type of a goal or key performance indicator, but it's also important, and we'll talk about in just a minute, but it's also important to make sure that you're having the conversations that really matter in an organization. So this is an organization that could use some help in terms of employee reviews or installing some type of metric for their folks. So here's some best practices that we'll share with you. The first one is to make sure that you're designing with the culture in mind. Here we go with our big word again around culture. And this is just to make sure that you're adapting your practices to the culture of your organization. So if you're Zappos, for example, and you're all about obsessive customer service and collaboration and partnering with clients, you're going to want to make sure that you also have a performance and talent system that is collaborative. So in some cases, I know some of our clients are doing team-based peer reviews as a way to embed that collaborative type of a collaboration. So make sure to keep your culture in mind. And then the next one is you as a leader must be the top human resource leader. I can't emphasize this enough. A lot of times we work with clients and they think that these types of practices should be driven by the HR department. Well, the HR department should obviously be involved, but it's you as a leader that has got to drive the initiatives. And I love what Jack Walsh said years ago. I'll never forget it. He said, you know, the day you became a leader, it stopped being about you and it started being about your people. And if you don't like people, get out of leadership. And so one of the key things about leadership is making sure to drive the human engine, and performance management is one of the key ways you can do that. And then make it a way of life. I mentioned this earlier. It's a lot of times we have a tendency to just put the review away and never to visit it again. Well, this is something you should be making a way of life. It's something that you should be using when it's time to promote and equip the organization. It's a great practice to be able to go back and say, who's ready? You know, who are our high performers? Who needs some help? And making sure that you are filling those gaps as you go. But make it a way of life. Make it a part of your regular, ongoing conversations. And then lastly, remember, it's less about the process and it's more about the positive conversations that are built on relationships. And I will tell you, those organizations that we know and that we work with who've adopted a more agile, ongoing, collaborative approach where they're meeting with their employees once a month. They're talking about the goals and priorities. They're talking about development. They're stretching their employees. They're having development conversations. These are the organizations that are really making that move from good to great. And so I would really encourage that for all of you that are listening and with us today. So, Chelsea, you ready to recap? We've covered a lot. We've got about 7 minutes left. Let's just do a quick recap, and then let's take some questions.
Okay, absolutely, Christine. So at the core, HR should be about humans. As we've seen, organizations that focus on their people significantly outperform those that don't. So while initially things may feel like a distraction, we assure you that they're not. They're setting you up for continued success. And then be honest about the level of alignment within your own executive team. We encouraged you as we were giving you these questions and showing you the visuals that you really ask yourself those questions. And so decide if you think that you have alignment within your organization. For growth to continue year over year, first, design a culture that supports the promise you make to your customers. That's another thing, that key takeaway we want you to walk away with is how critical it is that your culture aligns to your customer promise. Next is it's critical in order to outperform your competitors that you have employees in place that understand what is expected of them. And lastly, once employees understand that, standard processes are going to allow your teams to deliver value consistently every time. Finally, Jim Collins would say, get the right people on the bus and the wrong people off the bus. And, you know, that can't be more true. One final thought is that high-performing organizations treat employees like they make a difference, and they do. So thank you for letting Christine and I talk to you about human capital. I hope that you find some of the tips and tools helpful to enhancing your current human capital programs. Let's go ahead and open it up. We've got 6 minutes for Q&A.
Chelsea and Christine, terrific information, well delivered. We have several questions, so let's get started. Chelsea, you talked about hiring people for the right roles. How do you know if you have the right people in the right roles?
Oh, that's a really great question. It starts with a conversation, and so I would encourage having the conversations, looking at the skills and competencies that are required in that position, and then starting to create a way to assess your employees to see if they really are a good fit. And my experience is a lot of people that aren't in the right roles, they know it. And so once they feel comfortable having that conversation, they'll be pretty quick to tell you that's not the right role for them.
You know, I would just also I'm sorry, Bill. I was just going to add one quick thing, and that is that's why it's so critical to have the ongoing performance conversations, you know, whether it's once a month or once every other month. You can see someone who's struggling, obviously, by their performance. if the performance isn't, going well. So that's why those regular performance conversations are so vital. Sorry,
Christine,
go ahead.
That's okay. We had another question, Christine, for you. Where do I even start to build the culture I need?
That's such a good one. That's the magical question, isn't it? Well, we suggest that, and we shared some ideas here. It's probably a good idea to go back. But, where do you start? I think the best thing is to start asking ourselves, one of the things I will say to clients is, what are the top 3 things that describe your culture? And if that answer doesn't pop right out, then we have some work to do. But there's a lot of different ways you can go about it. We start with the customer promise, and we work with a team and we talk about what is the customer promise, and there's basically 4 different distinctions. And then based on that customer promise, what's the culture we need? What's required? That comes up next. And what are we doing that's working, and where are we working against ourselves? And then finally, what's the type of leader? What is the type of employee that's going to thrive in this organization? So it's really a 3-part. It's a kind of a 3-phase process. What's our customer promise? Who do we need to be as a culture? And then what kind of leaders do we need to be able to execute on our customer promise?
Excellent.
So,
Chelsea, we had a point of clarification. Is the 72-hour per employee training, was that an annual amount in the survey that was done?
Yes, I'm pretty sure, Christine. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yep.
Yeah,
I'm
okay.
about 72 years.
All right.
72
All right.
hours a year.
And Chelsea, just a follow-on question for you, and that is that where do you suggest starting when the culture seems very ingrained in your organization, but it's known that it must change for the company to grow?
That's a perfect question. It's exactly what Christine said and exactly what we find with our clients. And so starting with that promise conversation, we find is it's a common vocabulary. It's a common way for everyone to unite because everything has to be done in service to your customers. And anyone that's ever part of an organization can get almost, I've never seen anyone not be able to get on board with that thought process. And then you line everything up behind that promise. So it doesn't feel personal. It doesn't feel like we have the wrong culture or we're going to put the right culture in here. It's the what is necessary to deliver on the promise to our customers.
And we have one more question about training, and that you mentioned at the beginning of the training, top companies give that 72 hours per employee. However, for smaller companies, what are smaller companies, 35 employees, doing from a training program perspective?
I'll take that. Yeah, I think it's equally important for small. In fact, start it right. Have learning be part of the culture in the organization. But in terms of number of hours, I don't think there's any set number of hours. I think the key is to decide if you want to be a learning culture and then offer opportunities based on that. But, obviously one size does not fit all. It depends on your type of organization. I would just say it's important to have not only formal learning, maybe a once a quarter training, but also even more important is the informal learning opportunities. It's the coaching, it's the mentoring. And I would say that that's part of every healthy organization, whether you're 2 people or 200 people, is to make sure you're building a culture of coaching and mentoring and providing stretch and growth opportunities for folks. That's the informal piece that a lot of companies tend to disregard, but that's critical for every organization.
Well, Chelsea Wood and Christine Gunnovan-Sperity, thank you so much for a wonderful and informative presentation. That was really a fantastic job.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.
Fridays
Thanks, everybody.
with Vistage continues next week, July 29th at 10 a.m. Pacific and 1 p.m. Eastern. For working capital and growing companies, Ami Kassar of Multifunding will explore the different kinds of working capital programs available, ABL facilities, factoring, lines of credit, purchase order financing, and production financing. You'll understand the requirements for each program and what lenders look for, and you'll understand the pros and cons of each program and which ones are best for you. Review case studies on how companies have used different types of working capital programs to their advantage. So join us for that Friday, July 29th. This has been Fridays with Vistage. Thank you so much for joining us, and this concludes the webinar.